the trap I talk about in the book is that, one, when we think about somebody who led a meaningful life, oftentimes we think about like heroes, right? Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and those people who made tremendous difference in the world, or like Steve Jobs, or somebody like that in a very different way made a huge contribution to the society. And for most of us, when you hear that, well, that's not really me, I cannot do that. Right? So that's the high bar.
I am Sally Haldorson, Managing Director of Porchlight Book Company, and we are located just south of here, a couple miles, and we are bulk book specialists that ship books, mostly nonfiction, around the globe for author events and author signings and a whole bunch of good things like that. And so we tend to read a lot of nonfiction, and one of the books that I have had the pleasure to read is Life in 3 Dimensions, and I'm so lucky to be talking to the author today. And I am going to give you the floor for the moment to introduce anything that you would like the audience to know before we get started.
Sure. So my name is Shigehiro Oishi. I guess the 3 things I would say about myself is I'm Japanese. I grew up in this tiny town, but I left as soon as I can. I never, ever imagined that I would be living in the United States. I just thought I would live in Tokyo, just like all my college friends. And so this is just unbelievably strange. But I never imagined I would be, writing a book in English, for instance. So that's one thing. Second thing is I'm a personality and social psychologist. So, when you think about psychologists, you might be thinking about clinical psychologists, but I really don't know anything about deep psyche of human struggles and things like that. It's really sort of more scientific end of psychology. So whenever I go to party and say, oh, I'm a psychologist, and people are like, oh, but so I'm not that kind of psychologist. So you can ask any questions. I'm not analyzing anything what you say. And number 3, I think the third thing is I always love sports. And indeed, in elementary school, only A I got was sports. And the literature, the love for literature, really came a lot later. I was not interested in literature that much early on, but I think, as soon as I start reading, essentially I was just reading the sports section of the newspaper with my grandpa, and I think once you start reading, like Smo and what happened in the previous match, there are a lot of psychology behind it, and I think, I strangely got into literature from sports. So I still love sports. I love reading about sports, but I found that the literature a lot richer than the sports. So I guess that's 3 things about myself.
I think we are definitely going to talk about sports and literature tonight, and because this book ranges from references from basketball and WWE to Proust, and so we're going to cover a lot of ground today, but we're going to start out with the basics, and then I'd love for you all to be thinking about any questions that you would love to ask at the end of our time together. We'll open up a little bit of a Q&A, because I think this material, even if you haven't had the chance to read the book yet, will be really inspiring to make you think of some things that you might want to do in your life to achieve psychological richness, which is what we're talking about today. So the first thing we're going to do is sort of address the title of the book, right? Life in 3 Dimensions. And the first dimension that you introduce in the book is the pursuit of happiness. And so let's tackle that one first, which could be its own, well, it has been many a book. It could be its own topic, and talk a little bit about why Aristotle was wrong about happiness when he said that that happiness is the ultimate goal of goals. And what are the traps of pursuing happiness?
Great. So, by the way, I think if you have burning question, you can raise your hand. I think this should be more of the conversation, not just two of us, but all of us. So, I started my PhD back in 1995, so 30 years ago. And at the time when I applied for a PhD, there was only really one person who was studying happiness, which was Professor Edina at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So I studied happiness, and I really truly believed Aristotle was right. The ultimate goal of goals is happiness. And I actually, when I teach happiness well-being seminar, I start with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And so I wouldn't say Aristotle was wrong, actually. I think Aristotle
Maybe
was...
too aggressive.
No. Aristotle was right.
Right,
I think the happiness is the ultimate goal. But Greek word for happiness is eudaimonia. And the eu is good, and daemon is just the English word daemon, so good spirit on your side. So there, it was really a lot of sort of the good luck and fortune is the meaning of happiness. So Darren McHone, a historian, wrote a book called Happiness, A History, I think in 2006, which was a New York Times bestseller. But he also analyzed this word, happiness and eudaimonia, and at the time, people did not feel tremendous amount of control over your own happiness. So when we say in English, pursuit of happiness, happiness as something you can attain or pursue is already a little bit a strange, phrase, because original Aristotelian word eudaimonia was not, you have to be virtuous, you have to do your best, but ultimately, whether you get to be happy or not depends a lot to the external factors. He talks a lot about friendships. He talks a lot about relationships, but during the time, there are a lot of wars. You will lose your wife and children and everything, even if you lived virtuous life the entire life. So, again, I think that the Aristotle's Ethics is really just foundational book to understand how to live a good life. Just that 2,400 years forward, now the concept of happiness, especially in America, has changed so much. So if you look up the happiness in Webster Unabridged Dictionary in 1820s, primary definition of happiness is still good luck and fortune. And I asked my assistant to look it up every edition of the Webster Unabridged Dictionary, so they went to the library and looked it up, made a copy. And up until 1961, it is that definition, but in 61 edition, they denoted that good luck and fortune, archaic, no longer in use. And now the satisfaction of one's desires and goals is the primary definition of happiness. So we did the 30 country dictionary studies. So in each of the 30 countries, Norway, Germany, and many other countries. So what are the words in your own language, the happiness? And then just look it up in your dictionary, right? And then just translate and then just send it back to us. 24 out of 30 countries still had good luck and fortune as a primary definition of happiness. So when people like Japanese think about happiness, it is also not something really you can achieve. You have to be sort of blessed and fortunate to be that way. So unfortunately, in the US, it became something of success. So when I ask American students, so what words come to your mind when you think about happiness? So many people write the success, victories and things like that, which itself is not, bad. Just that if you construe happiness as a personal success, then our happiness sounds like personal failure. So then that's the trap I'm talking about, that especially in the elite universities, just students feel tremendous pressure to feel happy, partially because they think that they should be successful. They should be saying to the world that I'm doing well because they did well through entire their lives, right? So it is very hard to take a little failures. And on the other hand, if you think about happiness as luck and fortune, then unhappiness is just being unlucky. So you can take it much, much easier. So the way I think about the happiness trap is not that Aristotle was wrong, just that the way contemporary Americans think about happiness is a little bit tough for everybody who live and try to achieve that goal. So yes, psychologists do little trick, right? Experiments where half of them, they say, happiness is really important, guys, right? And then the other half, like, don't think about control conditions or nothing. And then they give the anagram task, and so you guys try to solve as many anagrams as possible. And of course, social psychologists give impossible anagrams to these people, so nobody can solve it. Unfortunately, in the condition, the people who are led to believe that happiness is really important, after the failure, they just ruminate. They are thinking about, why couldn't I do this, right? So that's the precursor to depression, this rumination. And then you should be just put aside, just forget and move on, right? So when you think about just happiness as an ultimate goal, personal goal, that's the trap. That little failure will trip you and then make you feel really terrible, as opposed to just, that's one of those things. Just forget it, move on.
I think what's interesting about that is the sense of control, right? The good fortune or being unlucky is something you can move on from, while feeling like you should be in control of the achievement of happiness is something that you can pass or fail. And ultimately, as you quote William James in the book, and every emotion is fleeting, that's a paraphrase, but it is, every emotion is temporary. So if you want to feel happy, it's a feeling and it's going to be temporary. So pursuing happiness is one dimension of a richer life, but only one of three. So the second one that you talk about is the pursuit of meaning, and how for some people who aren't going through their life trying to achieve happiness, trying to earn it, trying to buy it, whatever we do in order to have happiness, we may be looking and saying that a life well lived is a life that has a lot of meaning to it. And so let's do the same thing to that and say, what are the traps of singularly pursuing meaning in life?
Yeah, so the biggest debate in the scientific area of well-being really was this: which one is more important? Is it the happiness or meaning? And this really, I think, is captured very well by Donna Tartt. How many of you like Donna Tartt's The Secret History? Anyway, it's just incredible author. But when she published Goldfinch about 10 years ago, she went on the Charlie Rose interview, and then the Charlie Rose asked, what kind of question were you grappling with when you were writing the Goldfinch? And I was so surprised. Her answer was, what is a good life? Is it to make oneself happy, personal happiness? Or is it to make others happy, even at the expense of your own happiness? So oftentimes, when we think about meaningful life, usually it involves some kind of sacrifice and trying to make somebody else happy, trying to make a contribution to the society. So there's a very famous well-being researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Carol Riff, actually wrote a very famous article in 1989, which criticized my advisor at Dina's. Yeah, entitled, Happiness is Everything, or Is It? So she, brings up the case of Hitler. Of course, Hitler was a miserable person. He wasn't happy. But what if he was happy? Is it okay? Right? Of course, everybody says, of course it's not okay. So her argument was that maybe personal feeling of happiness shouldn't be the golden standard of good life. Rather, more objectively, whether this person is functioning well. And when we say somebody's functioning well, not that they can take care of themselves, but actually making some solid contribution to the families and communities and society. So I think there is a very strong case to be made for the meaningful life as the sort of the golden path to a good life. So one of my earlier graduate students, Mike Stiger, came to the graduate school in 2000 when I just started my faculty position at the University of Minnesota. And first thing he said is, Shige, I want to study meaning in life. And I just said, no way, don't do it. Happiness is already really difficult to measure. And Ed, my advisor, spent like 20 years essentially trying to convince everybody it's really, we can study happiness scientifically, right? Like, there are just so many people who doubted that. Meaning is even more difficult, so I discouraged him, but he was just persistent. So he finished his PhD in 2006, and now he's the Mr. Meaning in Life. I mean, he's really famous. He made a career out of meaning in life. So I think meaningful life is really important. But the trap I talk about in the book is that, one, when we think about somebody who led the meaningful life, oftentimes we think about like heroes, right? Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and those people who made tremendous difference in the world, or like Steve Jobs, or somebody like that in a very different way made a huge contribution to the society. And when we think about those people, or those people who went to Peace Corps, right? I mean, tremendous self-sacrifice for the sake of the world. And for most of us, when you hear that, well, that's not really me, I cannot do that, right? So that's the high bar. I think that culturally, again, in American culture, like a graduation ceremony, right? If you go to graduation, I mean, I've been there many times, and every year it's incredible, very inspiring, but at the same time, oh my gosh, go out there and change the world. And I'm like, I don't think I can do it, right? So I think it has become very much the pressure for a lot of young people to, I have to make a difference in the world. So that's the one side of the trap. The other side of the trap is that, empirically speaking, when we ask a bunch of Americans, and some people say their life is really meaningful, other people say their life is not that meaningful, but it so happened that political orientation-wise, politically conservative people tend to say their life is more meaningful, and even more extreme version was the right-wing authoritarianism was positively correlated with meaning in life. And you can think about some specific cases where, some young people really struggle finding direction. In some case, they are attracted to terrorist organization. And sociologists found again and again, just terrorist organization really gives you clear guidance as to this is the value you sacrifice, and you're really making a huge impact and difference for the world. And of course, for your in-group, that is great. You're really dedicating your life for your cause, but at the same time, in this case, there are some outsiders who suffer from this action. So, I came to believe that maybe single-minded pursuit of meaningful life has to be a little bit careful. Make sure, yes, you're really caring your family members and others, but make sure you are not doing that at the expense of outsiders and strangers. And so that's the potential danger. Sometimes when you don't feel meaning in life, you're gravitated toward this very strong group that has this we versus us mentalities, and that is a little bit of dangers I see.
And I think the parallel between those two, right, is that, again, there's sort of a pass and fail grading, right? I'm not doing enough, so I'm not contributing enough, I'm not leading a meaningful life. And what we introduce today in this book is a third dimension, and is not, again, in isolation, away from happiness and meaning, but you introduce a third way to a good life, which is this psychologically rich life. And it is a way to transcend the happiness and meaning traps. So we've talked about the traps. So let's talk about how leading a psychologically rich life is an antidote to some degree.
Right. So let me just back up a little bit, like how this idea came about to begin with. So it was summer of 2015. So by then, I was full professor at the University of Virginia. I had a lovely wife who is here and 2 kids, doing well. And so I asked myself, am I happy with my life? And I said, yeah. And do I feel like my life is meaningful? Yeah, I mean, my introduction to social psychology is very popular, and maybe I'm making some difference. I play baseball with my kids and just trying to help them become a better player. So I feel like my life has some meaning. But then I asked the next question. So if I have happiness and meaning, is it the full life? And I couldn't answer yes to that question. And whenever I have question, luckily I have my lab in university. So when the semester started, in the first lab meeting, I asked my graduate students, postdoc, undergraduate, what do you think? If somebody is happy and says their life is meaningful, is that a full life? And then half of them said, what are you talking about? I mean, don't be so greedy. If you're happy and meaningful, that's enough. Right? But there were other half who said, yeah, you're right. I feel like something might be missing. And when you look at essentially the predictors of happy life and then the meaningful life, you start to question, maybe happiness and meaning are not measuring everything, capturing everything of good life. So for instance, I already talked about political orientation. In terms of political orientation, conservative people tend to be happier and find their life to be meaningful. Then simple question is, then liberal progressive life is not a good life? That doesn't make any sense. We had also curious findings. So back in 2007, when the Facebook started, exploded on campus, I'm always behind on the social media, but my graduate student, Patrick Sita, was so interested. So, Shige, you have to have the, Facebook account. Let's do some research. So I said, okay, for research, I will do that. So I signed up and then essentially recruited University of Virginia students to come to the lab. And at the time, they didn't know about the privacy concerns, so they became friends with us. So what that allowed us is to look at their actual friendship network, unfiltered. So then we analyzed what percentage of their actual Facebook friends. This is very beginning, so these are not the distant friend, but the real close friend. How many of them, for white students, white and non-white, right? And we were sort of hoping that the students who have a lot of diverse friends are happier. And then we analyzed, and then result is complete opposite. So I'm like, did we code it correct? So like we checked, double checked, triple checked. It turned out the white students who have more white friends say they are happy. And this is statistically controlling for religiosity, household incomes and everything. So I really didn't want to publish this paper. I really didn't. So but the graduate student need the paper, so like we quietly published it. I hope Fox News wouldn't pick it up, right? It's like, oh, please don't pick it up. So, but years later, it really bothered me that like why white students with more diverse friendship networks are not as happy as the more homogeneous network. And those are the things that led to this new concept that maybe the concept that we need to capture is this more progressive, also diverse and unconventional kind of lifestyle, but that people still think and consider admirable and a good life. So we started to think about the case where somebody say, I'm not happy. Somebody say, I don't think my life is particularly meaningful. But objectively speaking, we think this person's life is quite admirable. So can you think of any cases, right? And it was interesting lab meeting. Jane Tucker, who was a philosophy major undergraduate at Dartmouth, said, oh, what about, Hermann Hesse's Narcissus and Goldmund? And Goldmund, life seems to be quite admirable. So both Narcissus and Goldmund were monastery students together. And Narcissus is a very religious person who stayed in the monastery and become the teacher. So who led essentially entire life virtuous Aristotelian life. On the other hand, Goldmund, from early on, he really struggled in the religious studies and he really wanted to get out of the monastery. So he decided to leave monastery, live a vagabond life, and, go through really just homeless and, going town to town. He almost, got killed throughout his journey. He questioned, what am I doing? What's the point of my life? But then eventually he entered this church and he see this wooden Madonna. And he was so taken by the beauty of this sculpture and sought who made it, and then started the apprenticeship, and he became a sculptor himself. And at the end of the novel, Narcissus essentially says to himself, usually, if you think about my life and Goldman's life, right, my life is much more orderly, virtuous, morally superior life. But from the God's eyes, wasn't Goldman's life as worthwhile as my own life? Experiential richness seems like all first hand. You have to go through everything. So maybe it's crunkier, but say psychological richness that you could experience vicariously through novels and films and from the stories that tell you, etc., etc. So
I think that's one of the takeaways of this book that I think is uplifting in terms of how we judge our own lives, and how for those of us who are really engaged in thinking about why am I here, what is my purpose, am I doing enough, and feeling maybe the shortness of life, that when we put ourselves against the high expectations of meaning or happiness, that ends up being unachievable or impossible. And what we talk about when we're talking about this psychologically rich life is that it's accessible. Like it's accessible because it's in the day-to-day, because it's in the small and the large. And I think the way that we can understand how this is different is that there aren't really any constraints. There aren't any sort of pre-definitions of what a psychologically rich life because it depends on the person. And as you were talking, I was thinking about how many of us have kids who, you may think they should go to medical school, and instead they really want to, take a year driving around the United States, and you're thinking that that is the wrong way to go, and they're thinking, they just want experience. But at the same time, there are, the kids who are gaming and who are watching sports, and we also judge that as to whether there is value and in what they are pursuing in terms of their lives and their interests. And what this theory makes available to us is a better understanding of our own experience at any level. But one of the things that I think can be a trap, of course, is that we have a lot of access now on social media to everyone else's lives. Everyone else's lives look richer. Everyone else's lives look full of experiences that ours don't when we're just getting up and packing our lunch every day. And that creates a sort of, modern anxiety in us that we need to double up on our experiences, right? Whether it's the books we read, or it's the concerts we go to, or the trips we take. So how is that maybe a misunderstanding of what experience and curiosity does in terms of building a psychologically rich life?
Yeah, so I think social media is really tough. I mean, make us really, confused. And I talk about Martin Heidegger's, Das Chaos, essentially just a chatter, like distraction all the time. That the modern life, all the conversations, it's just so many chatter. And it is very hard to switch that off and really focus on what is important. So when we are just looking at the social media or news all the time, it is really difficult to stop, pause, and really think about what is important. I think social media really make our life, not just psychological richness, but also happiness, very, very difficult to reach, because social media, of course, are really intentionally curated space. So they're just showing off 1% of the best of their life, but ordinary people don't know that, so they just take that as 100% of their life, and it's like, oh my gosh, Sally went to this amazing restaurant again. So obviously you don't want to engage in that. And whenever we think about social comparison, so the happiness researchers already know that the worst detractor of happiness is a social comparison. So every time we are engaging in social comparison, we just say sort of like, hey, let's not do this. But it is really difficult. And in Charlottesville High School, middle school, we had the principal, African American principal, Mr. Johnson. And I love his story. So he's from small town in Tennessee, and he went to University of Virginia as an undergraduate. And a moving day, right? He realized other people are carrying the suitcases, and they were carrying the black, the garbage bag to move in. So Mr. Johnson asked his father, who was a house painter, Dad, why everybody else has suitcase and we don't have it? And Mr. Johnson's father said, son, it's okay to be different. And then whenever I feel like I see this somebody who is leading luxurious or envious life, I try to say to myself, it's okay to be different. This is America. This is what's great about America. We can be different, and it's okay. So yeah, I think that the social media really pose a lot of challenge. But at the same time, to me, unlike money, right? Money, it's so easy to compare. 100,000 versus 200,000. Size of the house, very visible. 3,000 square feet, 5,000 square feet. How much, right? That's why I think the happiness, especially when you stake your happiness on objective academic career achievement, I think it is really, really hard to achieve because, I mean, you can always compare yourself with Jeff Bezos and somebody and feel miserable no matter how successful you are. And to me, the psychological richness is a little bit better because I feel like the experience is not really comparable all the time. And also, I think what is psychologically rich experience oftentimes is not objectively such a great thing. For instance, when we went to like Denver, right? I get lost, and it's like we're just fighting each other. Like why we should have taken that right and left and we're really miserable. But at the same time, you can say, oh, but this might be an interesting story. This is a psychologically rich experience, and once you can sort of have the psychological richness mindset, I think these potentially very frustrating negative experience could turn into interesting stories. And those stories are not like, oh, your story is way better than my story. So in a way, I think it is a very personal space. And essentially, I always think about psychological richness as just like the material richness has the assets and the bank accounts and so forth. You can imagine sort of the psychological, portfolio and how many sort of the interesting stories you have. And the more stories, interesting story you have, you're psychologically rich. And somebody who is really rich materially might not have as many interesting stories as you. So I think that's the way I think about it, and I hope that other people also think that I'm not advocating that you should go to Hawaii or you should just retire and just start cycling all over. Not like that, right? That might be a good idea too, but for some, but you can just have really interesting experience in your neighborhood and with your families and things like that too. So that's what I want to emphasize.
Some of what you said in there is a really good little teaser for the book because you have a section in here about storytelling and how storytelling helps create the psychologically rich mindset. And I think it's a really important section in the book in terms of how we practice it and how our lives are the stories that we tell ourselves, and we can choose what those stories are and how we recognize them. And so I would encourage everybody to get the book to read that section. I think one of the things that all of us feel like when we think about happiness, when we think about a life of meaning, as we're talking about psychological richness, is what happens when bad things happen to good people. And when we are looking when we're trying to achieve what we're trying to achieve, when we are looking for happiness and meaning, and yet something happens, you get the diagnosis, something happens to derail your plans. And how does this approach to psychological richness sort of work alongside misfortune to make misfortune sort of part of your story?
Right. So I think that, bad things happen to the good people. I mean, Fragility of the Goodness, famous book by Martha Nussbaum, the Chicago law professor and philosopher. But I think that, the way I think the psychological richness helps is that if you are thinking about happiness and then encounter this traumatic event, then that's devastating because that's a complete opposite of what you want. If you're thinking about maximizing psychological richness, however, this could be actually very positive thing, the good opportunity to think about, like, okay, this thing happened, like earthquake happened, right? This is not something you want. And you lose your house, memorabilia, and so forth. people really suffer. Like I studied, and 16 years later, they're still not as happy as those people who did not lose their house. But at the same time, they have tremendous, unbelievable experience and life story to tell. Oftentimes, they didn't realize how nice their neighbors were until these emergency situations happened. And some people, and most of us actually, are way more resilient than we think we are. And we recover from those tragedies and then find some, humanities, and we tend to become more pro-social after encountering these natural disasters. So I think we can think about some difficult, very difficult life experience as the springboard for the new discoveries and new learning, and perhaps you can redirect your story and add it sort of to your life, and you can potentially enrich your life as well. So, I mean, there's so many tragedies that are really, really hard to put the positive spin. So I'm not saying you just have to put the positive spin. It's just that, you just accept that as it is and see what else, we can learn from it.
So I'm going to close this part. We have 10 minutes left because time goes faster than we ever expect it to. And if you all want to think about any questions that you want to ask, but I would like to just close on my part by asking about your choice in the book to open the book and close the book, referencing a father and son relationship, in other words, your relationship with your father, and then you do some creative work at the end of the book to tell a different story that includes Kierkegaard and telling a sort of fictional version. But I would love it if you could tell people about why you decided to include your father's story and how your life differed from his and how they both represent psychological richness.
So frankly, I wasn't going to. It wasn't something I really wanted to put, but this is something my editor and book agent really, you have so many interesting personal stories, you should put it. And I'm like academics, I don't want to put too much personal information there. But as I think about my life and my dad's life, it's just so different. My dad is 91 years old. He still lives in the city, town where he was born. And like his father, great-grandfathers, and so forth, he was a farmer. And like him, I was the first son of the family, and I was supposed to take over the farm, but I was never interested in nature or a farm, so they gave up pretty early on, and therefore we led completely different lives. And actually, until like 10 years ago, I didn't realize how much divergent my life and my dad's life has been. And to my surprise, he's very happy. He could have left and had better job, better paying job in a booming town nearby, but he never did. And I always, as a child, look at the more wealthier friends and it's like, why didn't my dad do that, right? But in the end, he seems to be very happy. And I had certain personal academic success, but at the same time moving from city to city, and it was certainly very, very taxing for me, my wife, and kids. So that was the sort of the self-reflection and what happened to my dad and what happened to me. And the last part, I have this imaginary correspondence between me and my son. And I wanted to put it, but the editor said, no, don't put it. So I put it in the appendix. Because
it's your book.
Yeah, that's my book. But I thought that was a clever, playful summary of the whole book. So Kierkegaard has either or, the imaginary correspondence between the person A, the young man, and the person B, the retired judge. And this is the correspondence between the person who want to live hedonic, aesthetic life versus the judge who thinks that the marriage is the school for characters and, the virtuous life. So it's not like that, but I thought that would be fun to have the correspondence between me and my sons and summarizing sort of all the chapters. So it'll be great if you read it, because I don't think most of them read. Know that there is a summary of that.
But I do think that it's a great encapsulation of the book in showing that there are many different ways to live this life. There is not just one way, but if we focus on building our portfolio of rich experiences and we can take some encouragement that whether we are watching a movie or scaling Kilimanjaro, that we are creating a psychologically rich life in our own way, and there is value in everything that we do. And I think that is, should you go and pick up this book, it is the thing that you'll walk away from reading it. Does anybody, we did start a little bit late, so I think we have a few extra minutes, but does anyone have anything? We've got a question over here. Yeah.
What influenced you to become a social psychologist? Was it coming to the U.S. or your family dynamic that inspired you?
Yeah, so the question is, why did I become social psychologist? Good question. So undergraduate, I was a psychology major. So for the honors thesis, I was interested in midlife crisis. And then why in the early 1990s, some Japanese business people seems to be really depressed. And of course, I'm thinking about, should I be like that? But then I don't want to be like that. So I wanted to study like why Japanese in their 40s and 50s seems to be struggling. So I started out essentially interested in happiness and, midlife crisis and things of that sort. And it so happened that the expert on happiness was a social psychologist in the social psychology PhD program. So unlike most of them, I wasn't really interested in social psychology at the beginning. I was just simply interested in happiness and life satisfactions and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question was the Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. So in that book, of course, Dr. Frankl talks about his way of thinking about meaning in life. And I think, so in academia, we often define meaningful life as essentially consisting of three things. One is somebody, the person who is living, thinks that their life is significant. Their life matters to others. The second one is that there is a strong sense of purpose and direction in life. And then the third one is that we all have so many different roles, right? But all these fragmented roles feels like it fit together. So sense of coherence. So Viktor Frankl himself doesn't talk about those three, specific aspects, but what he talks about is really the subjective nature of meaning, right? I mean, he is in a concentration camp and he has to do this labor every day, but he is able to construct meaning because of his memory, right? He think about his pleasant dinner, family dinner, and then they sang along, and being able to remember and rehearse those things and having the hope for the future, that made it different, right? He observed that some, members or prisoners, they just lose hope, and then just so quickly, just physically, they deteriorate. So I do think that Frankl's this very subjective, perspective of meaning is very, very true. Very, very true. Like every time we study, it is very shocking. Like objective sort of kind of societal contribution and a personal sense of meaning is very independent. So I think if you haven't read it, I mean, that's the most important book in the meaning in life literature. So I strongly encourage it. Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the spontaneity actually is a huge part of the psychological richness. So I completely agree. Like Americans, especially professional American life, is so scheduled, right? So it is very difficult to be spontaneous. And there's a New York Times article, why it's so difficult to make a new friend after age 30. Because when you are 20s, especially when you're in college, your friends are nearby, so you can just pop in and out and you can be very spontaneous and have fun. But once everybody has a job, everybody has a partner, and everybody has family, then oh my gosh, there is no way you can be spontaneous and do anything. So I think, therefore, in a place like here in the United States, we really try to be mindful that we should be spontaneous here and there. And I think that is really, really important and what's missing from American get it done, sort of the productivity-oriented life.
Let's do one more. You had your hand up over here. Yep. Oh, okay. I mean, people can leave, we can keep talking, we can do whatever, but let's go with you.
So I did, you know, I'm on an email list sent out by Tyler Vanderbilt, and I was supposed to track
You mean Tyler at Harvard?
Yeah.
So he has his model of flourishing, and I think that's a very comprehensive model. And this is very academic. So people have different models of well-being, and the flourishing has, I don't remember how many dimensions, but many, many dimensions. So no, I think that he really tried to make it as comprehensive as possible using all the existing model. But I think psychological richness is not really captured by that model either. So Carol Riff, we talked about the University of Wisconsin professor. So she has 6 dimensions of psychological well-being. And one dimension is a personal growth. So personal growth is fairly close to psychological richness, but the rest is very much the meaning and the happiness. So, yeah.
Hopefully you'll go buy this book. Thanks everybody for coming. And thank you so much. Thank you.
I want to thank both of you so much for such a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you all for being here. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you.